the good news according to the book of Revelation. You can hear the gospel, reject the gospel, be deceived by Babylon, get the mark of the beast, the wrath of God, the judgments of God, the 7 last plagues, but you still will eventually be saved because God will win. Love will win eventually. Now let me prove that to you. Revelation 14:6, and I saw an angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to all the nations. The nations are lost. They need to hear the gospel to be saved. So the angel preaches the everlasting gospel to all the nations, saying, fear God, give glory to him, and worship him, for the hour of his judgment has come. So how do you show that you have accepted the gospel? You will fear God, glorify God, worship God. So if you've got those 3 things, you've accepted the gospel. Now, remember I said that. How do you show you've accepted the gospel? Fear God, give him glory, and worship him. And the nations need to get saved and then demonstrate that. And that shows they are saved. Look what happens to the nations. Revelation 14:8. They have rejected the gospel. They've heard it, but they rejected it. And instead, they climb in bed with Babylon. 14:8. Babylon the Great has fallen, and has made all the nations, those who just heard the gospel, drunk with the wine of the wrath of her fornication. They got in bed with Babylon. They rejected the gospel. Now they're deceived by Babylon. And then in verses 9, 10, and 11, the nations, if any one of the nations receive the mark of the beast, he will receive the wrath of God. Okay? You can hear the gospel, reject the gospel, get in bed with Babylon, get the mark of the beast in the nations, you're going to get the wrath of God. And what's the wrath of God? It's spelt out. It's defined for us in chapter 15 and verse 1. I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels holding the 7 last plagues. For in the plagues, the wrath of God is complete. So the nations, the lost, the nations means the lost, hear the gospel, reject the gospel, get in bed with Babylon, get the mark of the beast, get the wrath of God, which is now the 7 last plagues. And then in verse 2, we have another group. So currently, the nations who have rejected the gospel are now going through the wrath of God, the 7 last plagues. After the 7 last plagues, the saints, the saved, who didn't cave to the beast and worship the beast or get drunk and get in bed with Babylon, the saved who stayed loyal to Jesus, sing a song about the future. And they're singing this song after the 7 last plagues. Listen, verse 2 of chapter 15. And I saw something like a sea of glass mingled with fire, and those who have the victory over the beast, and over his image and over his mark and over the number of his name. And they are standing on a sea of glass, having harps of God. They're through it. They went through the mark of the beast. The 7 last plagues are falling on the nations, and it looks like it's all over. It's curtains. There's no more chance for them. But here they are after the mark of the beast, after the 7 last plagues, and they're singing a song of victory. And look what they say in this song. They sing about the future of the nations who heard the gospel, rejected the gospel, got in bed with Babylon, got the mark of the beast, got the wrath of God, got the plagues. Them, the nations, the lost, they sing about the lost, about their future. And they talk about the marvelous works of God. And they say this, great and marvelous are your works, Lord God Almighty. Why? Just and true are your ways. You've demonstrated your justice, O King of the saints. Verse 4, who will not fear you and glorify you, for you alone are holy. For all the nations will come and worship before you. What? 2 groups here. When is this song being sung? After the mark of the beast, during the 7 last plagues. The saints have proved themselves faithful, and they're singing a song of victory to God. So God, it ain't over. We know the nations because we know you. The nations who are currently receiving the 7 last plagues, for all the nations will come and worship you. The nations who heard the gospel, here's the slam dunker. I saw an angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to all the nations. Fear God, give glory to him, and worship him. If you've done those 3 things, you've accepted the everlasting gospel. But they rejected it there, as we saw all the way through this passage. And then, in verse 4, after the 7 last plagues, the future of the nations is spelled out. They're not yet with the saints worshipping God. And the saints are saying, after the 7 last plagues, who will not fear you, glorify your name, for all the nations will come and worship you. The nations. In context, the lost. They will come. They're not there yet.